Well, as you know, WOWO Radio, WOWO, is celebrating its 100th year of being around in 2025. Well, I want to give you a little backstory on things about WOWO that maybe you didn't know, and I'm going to take you back a number of years. As a matter of fact, I'm going to take you back to the year 1990. Well, that was, 35 years ago. Let me tell you a story of something that happened and how things changed and how WOWO became different after that date. Well, back in 1990, AM radio was still around, and WOWO was still number one, but, well, their ratings were starting to slip, and the reason was simple. FM radio was showing up in markets. Now, FM was sort of coming along because Japanese car makers had decided in their cars to put not just AM radios, but FM as well. So you had AM and FM radio in the cars. American dealers, well, they were still doing cars with AM radios, but people were figuring out you could go to stores and buy what is known as a converter, and it was plugged into your car, and you could suddenly have FM as well as AM in your car. There was a store here in Fort Wayne in Southgate Plaza called Audio City. It's owned by a guy by the name of Phil Coomer. Phil and I have been friends for, 30, 40 years. So we were all young folks back then, and Phil had that business, and he was doing big business and selling FM radios. Because you see, FM was a cleaner signal. It's in stereo. And, when thunderstorms came along, you were listening to stations like WOWO, which is an AM station. It would crackle and hiss and what have you. But FM was clear. Well, stations were showing up in Fort Wayne. FM stations were coming online. And they were taking WOWO's audience. And WOWO was starting to lose audience. And it was becoming a bit of a worry. Because they'd been number one for so many years, and suddenly FM was taking it over, and there wasn't much AM could do about it. Well, back in those days, I listened to another AM station in town. It was WGL. WGL was about 3,000 watts, three-letter station, been around a long time. But they were a talk station. They carried talk shows. There wasn't music or anything like that. They had guys like G. Gordon Liddy. But the number one guy they had was a guy named Rush Limbaugh. That's right, Rush Limbaugh was on WGL back in those days in 1990. Well, the owners of the WGL station was Frank and Connie Kovas, husband and wife. Frank was the lead guy, the engineer. And one day they put on their station, they said, hey, we're going to do a local talk show, and it's going to be 1 hour a day, Monday through Friday. And if you want to be a talk show host, send them your application. So I did. A bunch of other people did as well. And I was called in for an interview, and I interviewed with them, and they saw my background and my radio background. And they said, okay, we're going to hire you. And I didn't make a dime. It was free. I mean, you were just working for nothing, but it's because you wanted to work. And I said, okay, I'll do it on one condition. I want to do Fridays. So I started off doing Fridays from 8 to 9. And I did that for, a couple of years. And did it for nothing, but people would call in and talk about stuff, and it was a talk show in the morning. Well, that's what I did. Well, eventually along came the children's home over on Lake Avenue, was looking for a fundraiser. And they decided to come up with an idea called the Chili Open, and they contacted a lot of radio stations in town about having folks be on their committees to help promote the event. And I was asked to go do and be on that committee. Well, at one of the committee meetings, frankly, there was another gentleman by the name of Gary Noe, N-O-E. Gary Noe was the program director at WOWO. And, you kind of looked at him and, he was like a king, But as the meetings went on, Gary was Gary, and we were all in there from the various stations. The Chili Open was played in the middle of winter at the Allen County Fairgrounds. And I'm telling you, playing golf, that's what it was. Playing golf in the middle of winter. Now, people had their teams together, and they went out and played in the snow. They didn't have any holes, so they put a toilet seat down to represent the hole. Guys are using orange golf balls, so they wouldn't lose their golf balls in the snow. But at the big pavilion building there at the fairgrounds, they had a big breakfast going on, and they had, the eggs and bacon and sausage and pancakes. And I was standing in there and watching all the proceedings going on because I wasn't going to go out and play golf. And I was standing there, and Gary Noe comes up to me. I was standing there chatting. No, I'm Gary Noe. Oh, whoa. So anyway, he says to me, he said, hey, how would you like to work for a real station, a real radio station? I went, what? He said, yeah. Would you be interested in coming to work at WOWO? And I was stunned. I mean, WGL, 3,000 watts, not a big deal. I'm just doing 1 day a week. He says, come to work at WOWO. Well, ultimately, I said yes and did. And the reason I came to WOWO was because he said he had an idea. Gary wanted to put talk on WOWO. They didn't have any talk there. They had the music. They had the Bob Seavers, the Chris Roberts, and the Ron Gregory and B.J. Stone, and they were a music radio station at a time when talk was starting to turn things. So Gary says, tell you what we're going to do. We're going to put you on every night, Monday through Friday, 6 to 7 p.m. You're going to follow Ron Gregory. And I did. And they said, okay, you're going to be in a different studio, not the main studio, studio across the hallway, and you're going to be there by yourself. I said, well, how's the phone calls and stuff? Well, we're going to have an intern in the regular control room. That intern's going to send you messages on the little TV monitor, and you can see who's on what line and whatever comments they need to tell you. So I did the show every day, 6 to 7, and I did it for, a couple of years, I guess. And but that producer apparently was an intern. I didn't know who it was, and they would take the calls, and then I'd see him on the screen, and then occasionally that producer would write something snarky or whatever, and the comments that I had, or I talked about. But that was about it. Well, eventually they decided they wanted to have sports talk on at 6 o'clock at night, Art and Dean, and that became sports talk, which is legendary in itself. So I was relegated back to part-time. All right, so this was around 1992. Well, what happened was Price Communications owned WOWO back in those days, and the owner decided he was going to sell the license to WOWO to another family in New York City. And let me tell you why. WOWO was a 50,000 watt radio station, one of many 50,000 watt radio stations. They were called clear channel radio stations, and they were set up in case there's a big emergency nationwide that the 50,000 watt radio stations, with their signals being as strong as they were, could reach everybody in the United States and get people information, emergency stuff. Okay. Well, at night, WOWO station was aimed to the east. Our power all went to the east, 50,000 watts. We covered everything on the East Coast. You could go from clear to Canada, down to Florida, and you could hear WOWO at night. Well, there was this station in New York City called WLIB. WLIB was an AM station. It was a daytime-only station that was on the frequency 1190. That was the same as WOWO's. But they had to shut down at night because, well, WOWO took precedence because we were a clear channel, 50,000 watt station. Well, as it turns out, the people who owned WLIB was the Sutton family. They're black, African-American family, but in New York they were very, very powerful family. As a matter of fact, you probably wouldn't know who the Sutton family was, but if I mention the name to you, Malcolm X. Remember the name Malcolm X? Yeah, movies, what have you. Malcolm X was a Sutton. He was one of the Sutton family. And Mr. Price, who owned the station, sold the license to WOWO. He got on a radio and sold it to the Sutton family. Well, the Sutton family, the only thing they wanted that license for was so they could take WOWO and make it go dark, make it end, be it finished. Because the Suttons want to make sure their WLIB would be on the air 24 hours a day. And by having WOWO go dark and go out of business, basically, they could run their station 24 hours a day. That's what they wanted. That was the plan. Well, as it turns out, it didn't work out that way. Because a company out of Elkhart, Indiana, Federated Media, headed up by a gentleman by the name of John Dilley, decided they wanted to buy the WOWO station, WOWO frequency, and they did. But the provision was that WOWO would have to cut back their power and no longer be 50,000 watts at night. Trust me, that was a big deal. And I remember when the station was bought by the Dilleys, they sent down their HR person. And we were in WOWO's third floor building downtown, right there on Wayne and what have you. And we were in that building. We all went into the general manager's office. I think her name was Gina, female. And we're all sitting in the office. The HR person comes in and talks to us about what's going to happen now, the new ownership. This is going to come in. This is going to happen. And somebody said, "Are you going to cut our power?" The lady didn't have anything to say. In fact, she didn't say anything about that. But we kind of knew something was going on. Well, as it turns out, yes, the word was out that WOWO, that the new owners of the frequency at the time wanted to cut back on the power on the station. That was part of the agreement. Well, the other stations in the United States that are 50,000 watts, they got all in a tizzy. They got upset. How dare you do that? You're taking it away. You could take it away from them, too. And they didn't want that to happen. The president of the United States at that time was a guy named Bill Clinton. Well, Bill Clinton was tight with the black community, and he went to him and he said, here's the deal, folks. It's a one-off deal. We need to do that because the Sutton family, very powerful in New York, they want their station to be able to be heard 24 hours a day, and it's the only station that's going to lose their power in the United States. So all the 50,000 watt stations around the United States, we're talking Chicago and Cincinnati and St. Louis, I mean, they were all over the country, said, okay, fine, we'll let you do that, take one station. We were the sacrificial lamb. And that's what happened. Well, throughout the entire thing, WOWO's audience kept decreasing and decreasing. And as a result of being sold, we moved out of downtown, out into Maples Road on the south side of Fort Wayne, which was the headquarters of WMEE and WMEF. That was the FM station back then. WMEE was 1380, if my memory serves me right. Mornings, they had a guy, Charlie and Tony, in the morning. Remember those names. So we ended up moving down to the Maples Road location, and we started broadcasting from down there. Now, I was working weekends, Saturdays is my rule. It was usually from noon to 3, or 3 to 6, whatever it was. So, and because of IU football and IU basketball, I was frequently bumped. I wasn't on, but I was there every single Saturday working. And even though when they had the games, you didn't work. But I did that for 5 years, 1992 to 1997. Well, during that time, more people were abandoning AM radio and going to FM, and WOWO was losing. So they made a decision, let's get into talk radio. And they started to do that. And the first thing they started to do is let's take the morning show, and let's find someone to host the morning show. And they went for certain guys. There was one guy, Dave Macy, they had a guy. Another guy was Jay Walker. Used to be at Channel 21, the weather guy. He was another morning guy they tried. They kept trying morning people because morning drive was a big aspect. If you had morning drive, that was powerful. So WOWO was gradually switching from music into talk. And they had Sean Hannity, they had Glenn Beck, they had Dr. Laura, they had Mark Levine. I mean, they had a few people, but they didn't have a heavyweight because Rush Limbaugh was still over at WGL. Well, something happened. Now, I don't know what it was. I was never told what it was, but something had happened involving Rush's contract, requirements and stipulation for the people that ran the show, and apparently something over at GL happened that, well, kind of voided that contract. I don't know what it was. I still don't know to this date. But because of that, the company that controlled Rush Limbaugh offered Federated Media, which is where I was now working, you could have Limbaugh. Plus, WOWO at that time was 50,000 watts during the day. And Limbaugh was on from noon to 3, so 50,000 watt station, noon to 3 for Rush Limbaugh, as compared to 3,000 watts at WGL. That was a big deal. And that made sense to the marketers of Rush Limbaugh. So they said, okay, we're moving from GL, we're moving to WOWO. Well, and that meant that Rush Limbaugh was coming to WOWO. And on shortly around that time, the program director of WOWO was a guy named Tommy Allen. Tommy Allen came up to me one day in a hallway and he said, hey, would you be interested in doing afternoon drive, 3 to 6 p.m.? Because Rush was scheduled to be from noon to 3. Would you be interested in doing an afternoon drive, 3 to 6? Heck, I've been doing weekends for 5 years. I was stunned. Man, put me on after Rush Limbaugh? Are you kidding? Well, that's exactly what happened. So they drew up a contract. It was one page. One-page contract. You could have written it out on a cocktail napkin. We're going to pay you, $25 an hour? And the other clause was, and if you take us to number one, now being number one, because WOWO had lost that. The FM stations were surpassing WOWO with music because that's what people wanted to listen to. And so WOWO was no longer number one. They said, well, if you become number one in 25-54, which was the demo age of 25 to age 54, that's the money demo in the advertising business. They said, well, if you do that, you take that slot, and you become number one, we will pay you a handsome bonus. Well, the ratings back in those days were taken twice a year, in the spring and in the fall. So there were 2 books a year. And if you were number one in any of those books, they paid you a bonus. That was the deal. Well, so there I was. Came on the air March 17th of 1997. So yes, that's when I started as the afternoon drive in Fort Wayne, following Rush Limbaugh. But here's something you need to know. So when I was going in to do that, they said, well, we got to have a producer for you. Someone's got to run your show, run the board, take the calls, talk to people. And they said, well, who can we get to do this? Well, you remember I told you that when I was down in WOWO downtown, I was working in a studio, and there was a person in the control room writing me messages on a television screen? I didn't know who that person was. Turns out that person was still working at Federated. She had come over with the transition, and she was working in the log building department. And building a log means you set up where the commercials are from what day and what time and what have you. And they were basically the log builders. That's what they did. Well, that's what she was doing. And they said to her, hey, you worked with him when you were down at downtown. You could be his producer. She was reluctant to do it. She didn't want to do it because she was, left of center. And I was, right of center. So we were diametrically opposed in our political beliefs. But reluctantly, she took the job because they said, you're going to take the job. Who knows what they would have done if she didn't. So she came in and she was my producer. Name was Diane. Didn't know that at the time. Kept calling her the Queen because that's the only thing I could remember because I'm not good with names. And we started doing the show. Like I said, she was left of center on social issues, and I was, right of center on social issues. But we were both right on the side of fiscal issues. So we had something in common. Well, as the days, weeks, and months went on, we were just doing our stuff every day. And ended up, a couple of things happened. I started a website because the internet was starting to become a big thing. WOWO didn't have a website. No, I don't think any other radio station had a website. I said, well, why not do a website? So I went and purchased the name, The Pat White Show. Bought a program and bought a software kit. Did my own website. I did it at home, make my own, put pictures in, stuff like that. Advertise it. Hey, the Pat White Show on WOWO.com. That's what I did. People started showing up to it who were getting into the internet. They could see pictures, stuff going on. Pictures of the station, everything else. I did that. So we kept going on. And year after year went by, and finally about 3 years in, lo and behold, WOWO had become the number one station in the market. Back to number one where we used to be. And let me tell you why. In the morning, we had a gentleman by the name of Charlie Butcher. Remember Charlie and Tony back in the old MEE days? Well, Tony Richards put Charlie in, and finally in the morning, and Charlie clicked in the morning. So there was Charlie in the morning doing morning drive, and you had Glenn Beck, Rush Limbaugh, and me. And after me, they had Sports Talk, and then Sean Hannity. And Sports Talk had Art and Dean, and Dean McNeil came in, and they had a full location. We had switched from music to all talk radio. And that's what we did. And that's dating back when I started in March 17th of 1997. And the reason I tell you all of this is because WOWO is now going into its 100th year. But there was that gap back in there when WOWO was in the music, but the music was starting to die because FM was taking it over and WOWO was an AM station. That wasn't going to work. Ultimately, they transitioned to FM. And the guy that made things happen was a guy named Gary No. He was the program director who had the vision to say, hey, we could switch into talk. And he brought me in to do a 1-hour show, 6 to 7, back in 1992. So, there I was, an employee of WOWO since 1992. And you know what? Looking back, folks, it was an extreme honor to serve. On a station like that, to be able to say, I worked at WOWO, that is something I will cherish for the rest of my life. Because WOWO was something. WOWO was special, And to many people, WOWO is history. And now you know the rest of the story.
Happy